Hello, everybody. Welcome to our latest Robot 101 event. We're really honored and pleased to have Professor Heather Love from University of Waterloo with us. Not just today, but actually we have her for a whole week. And she has already, within hours of arriving here, had some fantastic lectures, lectures in classes, including mine. Today, her talk is on R.U.R's Robot Rebellion, Cybernetics Lineages and Cultural Legacies. This is material actually that she talked about a little bit in my class yesterday. I'm really excited to hear more about that. And of course, this is setting giving us some context, setting the stage for the performances of R.U.R, which are starting tomorrow. I see a couple of people involved in the production here in the audience. We're really excited about that. So I love the fact we've got this opportunity to get a background and get a context on this really important play.
Thanks everyone for coming here. Thanks for the introduction, Chuck. And also thanks to everybody who was part of inviting me to be here for today. It's my first trip to the UP. It's been wonderful so far. I got to see lots of beautiful fall colors on the drive up on Wednesday, and then I got to have the largest monsoon I've had since June's in Indiana. That was fun. I've been able to catch up with old friends, meet people like Chuck, who I've never met in person, although we've had plenty of virtual interactions, and also getting to work with MTU students in a few classes. So it's been wonderful. So everyone who's here in person, as well as hello out there, everyone who's tuning in on Zoom, either now or at a future date, good afternoon, and thanks very much for coming. So I'd like to begin by situating this talk today within the broader trajectory of the whole Robot 101 series. Really, because for me, it's been a treat to be able to listen into the past few speakers, and I know there's additional excellent talks coming up. So I encourage everyone to check out the recordings. There's the website there, and I understand the first few ones are either up or soon will be up. And as they happen, they'll be there. So I encourage everyone, check them out. So just to give a little bit of a recap, a couple of weeks ago, we heard from Nick Johnson and Chris Murray, and they're the creators of a new comic book adaptation of R.U.R. And I thought it was really fascinating to see how they had determined the aesthetic style of the book by looking to art by Karel Čapek's brother, Josef. He's a visual artist who actually illustrated a bunch of Čapek's works. And also they talked about how they incorporated various background details in the images to emphasize the play's thematic elements and broader social commentary. And also I liked hearing about how they thought about translating the narrative sequence and order of events from the play's 3 acts and epilogue into this mixed textual visual mode of the graphic novel. So very cool there. Then last week, Alexander Weinstein was here and he gave a talk that took the form of a lyric essay and invited us to consider how speculative or fantasy work can provide a pathway for authors and artists, not only to send out really prescient warnings about things we want to avoid, but also more positively or optimistically to build up the types of worlds and social structures that we do want to generate. And I do think that the majority of R.U.R falls into the former context of kind of gloomy, prescient warning. But I think that Alexander's provocation there at the end got me thinking a bit more about the epilogue and what might be going on there in this final session or section that suggests maybe some kind of new beginning, although it's still a bit bleak and still very strange. And then I know that next week we have Jindřich Toman, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, who will be zooming in, I hear, from Prague. And I think that's going to be a very rich discussion of the various early 20th century contexts that informed the play. So we've had then a discussion of a direct adaptation, a broader discussion of the role of speculative fiction and how this type of literature plays a role in our culture. And then we're going to be getting a really detailed discussion of the play in its own historical context. And the series doesn't end here. I just figured maybe I shouldn't spend my entire talk just doing previews for other things. So there's more on the go. Go to the website. So what I would like to do, since we have the play itself coming up this weekend and next, so everyone attend that for sure. We're approaching opening night. So what I'm going to do today is offer a series of observations about some of the play's different scientific, technological, and cultural legacies, And I'll be building here on some of my own research about literature and cybernetics, more on that in a moment, but also branching out a little bit into contemporary culture. So the goal is kind of to prime everyone for attending the play by giving you a few things to think about as you watch, especially if you might be interested in how the play has had and still continues to have an enduring legacy in terms of its relevance and significance. Okay, so as I think there's like a biography somewhere, I'm not sure, but some of you may know this, that I mentioned that I study literature and cybernetics. So my main area of research is early 20th century modernist literature. And I look at authors like Ezra Pound, John Dos Passos, Virginia Woolf, and Gertrude Stein, and explore how the strategies they develop in their experimental work for navigating complex informational or communicational environments, how that resonates often formally with some of the technological frameworks that emerged in the middle and later part of the 20th century under the rubric of cybernetics. So this is things like feedback loops, information entropy, black boxes, second order ideas about self-reflexivity. And the overall argument I set up in that work is that it makes sense to think of literary texts as part of the cultural lineage of what I call cybernetic thinking. And that by extension, then we should expand or extend both the historical and the disciplinary scope of cybernetics. So we should think about cybernetics not only as a technical field, but also as an aesthetic undertaking or more philosophical undertaking. And also that we should look further back in time than the typically cited World War II origins of cybernetics as a discipline if we want to understand its emergence and significance. So then that's all by way of saying that part of the reason I think I'm here today with you is that my research focus aligns with the historical time frame and genre of Čapek's work as a literary scholar of early 20th century kind of formally experimental work, but also that my interests straddle that boundary between the literary and the technological in ways that I hope will prove illuminating. And that the work I've been doing is invested in many of the themes that Čapek takes up or is invested in exploring in something like R.U.R. So we are going to have a chance to look at a few specific scenes in the play in a little bit. But for those of you who haven't read the script or seen any version of the production, I wanted to give a bit of an orientation to the narrative. There are going to be some spoiler alerts here, but I'm sure it is not going to ruin the experience of actually seeing the play in its entirety. So this is the story of the play as presented by the people who did this edition. So setting the scene here. So the play is on an island somewhere on our planet, and on the island is the central office of the factory of Rossum's Universal Robots, which comes from the Czech word meaning worker. So when the play opens, a few decades beyond the present, a factory has turned out already, following a secret formula, hundreds of thousands and even millions of manufactured workmen, living automats without souls, desires, or feelings. They're high-powered laborers, good for nothing but work. There are two grades, the unskilled and the skilled, and the specially trained workmen are furnished upon request. So opening scene, Helena Glory, the president of the Humanitarian League, comes to ascertain what can be done to improve the condition of these overspecialized creatures, and Harry Dahmen, the general manager of the factory, captures her heart and hand in, I love this line, the speediest courting on record in theater. It's a very weird scene. I can't wait to see what we do with it on your play. Then the last two acts of the play take place 10 years later. Due to the desire of Helena to have robots more like human beings, Dr. Gall, the head of physiological and experimental departments, has secretly changed the formula. And while he has partially humanized only a few hundred robots, there are enough to make ringleaders, and a world revolt of robots is underway. So the robot rebellion of my title. The revolution is easily accomplished, as the robots have long since been used when needed as soldiers, and they also far outnumber human beings. This is also a kind of funny paragraph. The rest of the play is magnificent melodrama, superbly portrayed, with the handful of human beings kept at bay while the unseen myriads of their own robots close in on them. And at the end of Act 3, everyone is about to die. Almost, because we get the epilogue in which a character named Alquist, the company's builder, is not only the only human being left on the island, but also the only one left on Earth, because the robots have destroyed the rest of mankind, and they spared his life because he was a worker. So he's spending his days unceasingly endeavoring to discover and reconstruct the lost formula to create the robots, because they're doomed. They saved the wrong man. They should have saved the physicist. They saved this guy who has no idea how to make more robots. And this is a problem. They know their bodies will wear out in time. There will be no new multitudes of robots to replace them. But at the end, Alquist discovers two humanized robots, a young man and young woman, who have a bit of Adam and Eve in them. And the audience perceives, I'll be curious to see how this plays out in the play, that mankind is about to start afresh. So that's how they summarize this. I hope that that slightly long overview is okay. And I'll look forward to seeing where the emphases shift. I would like to just read one more synopsis by Jennifer Robertson. It's very brief, but it emphasizes some different aspects of the play that I think are good to have in mind as we move forward here today. So she describes R.U.R. as, quote, a science fiction melodrama with comical passages. So interesting thinking about the tone of the play. And she summarizes narrative like this, which I find a bit more tongue-in-cheek. Anatomically realistic artificial humans are mass-produced in Rossum's factory from protoplasmic matter and sold all over the world as tireless workers. Then they revolt en masse after new model robots are provided with emotions and are able to experience anger at their exploitation by humans as slave labor. So that's a little bit of a different take on the play, but the same storyline coming through in both of them. Okay. In light of these accounts, it's probably not too surprising that this play has predominantly been read, in Lisa Swanstrom's words, as a scathing critique of assembly line production that sheds light on the dehumanizing conditions of the people forced to work in this way, and a satirical take on the emergence of the modern factory with its attendant attributes of efficiency, time management, and modular labor. Anne McKnight provides one example of this type of reading. She describes the play as a revolutionary labor narrative, and Derek Johnson similarly notes that a central element of this play is the idea of the worker as a victim of economic and social forces. So if elements of the narrative that I've recounted and also these types of social critiques sound familiar or common, that's probably not too surprising. After all, Swanstrom labels R.U.R. as the defining template for all subsequent robot stories. And a 2014 article on robots in Japanese culture by Seth Jackovitz states that the basic narrative of R.U.R. has become the fodder of endless science fiction remakes ever since its debut. So we have this idea that this play has reappeared in all kinds of places over and over and over again in our culture. And I'd like to spend some time today tracking a slightly different type of remake, if you will, namely the reappearance or redeployment or reconfiguration of several core thematic motifs from R.U.R. within the more technologically oriented discourse of cybernetics. So this is a lineage that I see as equally significant to the many more entertainment genre robot spin-offs that R.U.R. has inspired. And by recognizing the common through lines in R.U.R. and cybernetics thinking, I think we're able to understand Čapek's work as part of a more widespread emergent early 20th century cultural discourse of cybernetic thinking. So part of that bigger project that I'm thinking about, I think this play is a really interesting contributor to that. And in this cybernetic thinking space, then works like R.U.R. still exert major, I think, influence in our 21st century world as well. So to explain what I mean by this phrase, cybernetic thinking, I turn to this fellow, Norbert Wiener, the MIT mathematician who has been referred to by his biographers as the father of cybernetics. So Wiener came of age during the early decades of the 20th century when an influx of media across multiple platforms like print culture, sound reproduction and transmission, cinema, and more, all of these things kind of coming up in tandem with a very quickly evolving field of technological capability. This required members of the general public to confront and navigate probably larger quantities of information than ever before. Not to say that the Victorians didn't have to deal with a lot of print culture, but things kind of up the ante at the level of scale when we get this mass type of cultural production. Okay, so in the wake of these new technological developments, Wiener argued that humans were forced rather suddenly to confront, quote, the limits of communication within and among individuals. And that fact was especially significant to him because his cybernetics theories proposed that society can only be understood through a study of the messages and the communication facilities which belong to it. So he's really focused on communication and control. Those are the paired terms that come up in his book on cybernetics. And I should pause here to provide just a little bit of a gloss on the term cybernetics, which Wiener coined in a 1948 treatise, technical treatise with that name. The etymological origins of the word cybernetics are from the Greek word for governor. And this word came to encompass a really ambitious interdisciplinary undertaking involving scholars from fields as diverse as anthropology, psychology, sociology, biology, physics, engineering. So all across those different domains, people were seeing themselves as united. And they convened in the 1940s and 50s during the famous Macy conferences on cybernetics. And there's lots of great scholarship on that. So this field of study eventually gave rise to the computer-dominated world we live in now. But as scholars like Céline Lafontaine point out, this is a quote from one of her articles, no unified definition of cybernetics has been able to impose itself. And Andrew Pickering's statement here really echoes that idea, right? He says, there's many stories to be told of the evolution, the coming together, and the drifting apart of these threads of scientific work related to cybernetics is what he's talking about. One can almost say that everyone can have their own history of cybernetics. But despite these historiographic and definitional challenges, there are some helpful summaries on the American Society for Cybernetics website, and they clarify some things like cybernetics is adopted in the 40s at MIT, refers to a way of thinking about how complex systems coordinate themselves in action. It's originally formulated as a way of producing mathematical descriptions of systems and machines. And it comprises the study of systems which can be mapped using loops, so feedback loops, or more complicated looping structures in the network defining the flow of information. In its various iterations, cybernetics posited that machines, like the anti-aircraft gun that Wiener worked on with Julian Bigelow during World War II, a prediction machine, that they can be programmed to learn from the past. Cyberneticians kind of proposed that human brains can be understood as complex computers, and that information can circulate freely along conscious and mechanical challenge. So different people kind of adopted different of those things, but that's the cluster of types of ideas we get coming through. So by cultivating technologies of large-scale data processing, statistical probability, and feedback response mechanisms, cyberneticists really cast human subjectivity and mechanical technology as fundamentally imbricated together in a complex communicational matrix. So summing up these ideas in his 1950 monograph, and I just liked these two covers because they reminded me of the Robot101 cover, so it's kind of a fun connection. The human use of human beings. In this book, Wiener described the 20th century communication landscape as a field in which messages between man and machines, between machines and man, and between machine and machine are destined to play an ever-increasing part. And the similarity between human and mechanized or artificial communication strategies, I think, is best encapsulated in his notion of feedback, which he defines as, quote, the property of being able to adjust future conduct by past performance. And for humans, this idea signifies the ability to learn from messages we receive through our senses and then respond by adapting our behavior to more effective future actions. But in a significant technological twist, Wiener posits that this adaptive response capacity can function across the human-machine divide. So that's the second quote there. It is my thesis that the physical functioning of the living individual and the operation of some of the newer communication machines are precisely parallel in their analogous attempts to control entropy through feedback. So within this new world of technologically driven communication, Wiener is saying, machines can learn from experience just as humans do, which brings us back to R.U.R. So the notion that Čapek's play invites us to consider some of the parallels or areas of overlap between human subjects and their mechanized counterparts is fairly obvious from the opening act of the play, in which Helena expresses incredulity at the revelation that Damon's secretary, Sulla, is in fact a robot. So here's an excerpt from the exchange that takes place between the three of them after Damon summons Sulla back into the room. Helen says, "Where do you come from?" And she says, "From the factory." "Oh, were you born there?" "I was made there." And Helena goes, "What?" And looks at Sulla, looks at Damon. And Damon says, "Sulla is a robot, best grade." And then a little bit more goes on, and he says, "You wouldn't know that she's made from different material from us, would you? Turn around, Sulla." And Helen is getting very agitated here, saying, "Oh, stop, stop." And Damon instructs the robot to talk to her. She says, "Please sit down. Did you have a pleasant crossing?" And they have a little bit of an exchange here. And at the end of it, Helena jumps up and she says, "This is absurd. Sulla isn't a robot. Sulla is a girl like me. Sulla, this is outrageous. Why do you take part in such a hoax?" She says, I am a robot. And Helena sort of refuses to believe this. No, you're not telling the truth. I know they forced you to do it for an advertisement. Sulla, you're a girl like me, aren't you? But she's like looking at Damin as well as looking at the robot. So again, I'm looking forward to seeing how this gets staged. But I think this scene reads as something of a preview to the later Turing tests, right? And its basis particularly in conversation and linguistic prowess, because at one point Sulla shows that she can speak 4 languages. That these types of details indicate the extent to which Čapek is interested, like Wiener, in probing the realm of communication as a site for exploring the blurred distinctions between human and robotic other. So he gives us the prototype, I would say, Čapek does, for the types of interactions that will transform in new contexts as they become the technical puzzles and projects of mid to late 20th century cybernetics experiments. And then when they go on, like in Westworld and Battlestar Galactica and Blade Runner and all manner of other things, to infiltrate later fictional as well as reality-based tech narratives. If we think of chatbots that you can't quite tell if you're talking to the human or the robot, and various other forms of Turing tests that have been adopted and are out there today, and many more things. But I won't make this just a list of new technologies. I'll let you think about those things. So in this type of interaction, I think we see Čapek, Wiener, and then ourselves today grappling with questions of ontological uncertainty in different types of technological contexts. All right, I just want to check time. Okay, we've got good time. Excellent. So I do want to touch on one more example to illustrate this particular lineage about blurred human-machine or human-robot identities. And this comes later in the play when the robot hordes are descending on this tiny cluster of human beings, human factory managers, and also Helen, the almost lone female representative, although she also has a servant who comes up in the quotes in a little bit. So at this moment, the script again emphasizes the key role that language plays in establishing the robots as adept information processors. Sorry, I'm in the States. Processors who can respond flexibly and adapt to feedback strategically. So here, Damin is reading aloud from a handbill that these newly arrived robots have dispersed and kind of thrown out all over the island. He says, "Damnation, robot," and then he reads what's written on this handbill. It says, "Robots throughout the world, we, the first international organization of Rossum's universal robots, proclaim man our enemy and an outlaw in the universe." And I think this response he has is really important. He says, "Good heavens, who taught them these phrases?" I mean, it's a funny and an ironic moment, but it's like, how did they learn to use the language and the sentences and the word order and the putting together of things in this particular way to accomplish what they're trying to do, which is annihilate us all, right? And Dr. Gall, the psychologist who actually like sent the robots on this path to self-realization, he says, "Go on." And Damin says, "They say they're more highly developed than man, stronger and more intelligent, that man's their parasite. Why, it's absurd." So these like little tags that show his response to it, I think are really important. And then goes on to say, "We command you to kill all mankind. Don't spare any men, spare no women, but do save the factories, railways, machinery, mines, and raw materials, because work must not be stopped." So it's the humans we have to get rid of. It's the work that can't be stopped. There was a very interesting discussion of this in Chuck's class the other day about the idea that what are they going to do with all the stuff they produce when there are no humans left, since they've been programmed to produce this stuff for humans to use. So there's lots of interesting things going on here, I think, both with the mastery the robots have of language, but also the limits of kind of logic or understanding that are happening. So just kind of to recap, I think the bolded phrases, they register Damin's shock as he recognizes the robot's ability to adapt phrasing that they presumably have learned from humans. And within this very militarized scene of attack, the robots also demonstrate what we might label a tactical adeptness that resonates with some of Wiener's later cybernetics writing, particularly when we're thinking about communication and technology. He writes about the importance of securing and controlling communication infrastructure during battle. So he says at one point in The Human Uses of Human Beings, the whole technique of secrecy, message jamming, and bluff is concerned with ensuring that one's own side can make use of the forces and agencies of communication more effectively than the other side. Side note, there's a ton more to say about cybernetics in military context and the way that R.U.R is resonating with those themes, but I'm just going to give this tiny little glimpse of it here because that would be an entire other talk. But in the same scene that we just looked at a little bit later, Damen suggests that one of his men telephone the electrical works because they're trying to kind of get all the humans that are left together into one room. But he learns that the robots have charged the air with static. And then previously to the arrival of the robots, all communication with the mainland had been blocked for, I think, a series of about a week, 5 years? No. It's an extended time that's noticeable, but it is a recent amount of time. Yeah. So by the time the humans figure out that they may be in over their heads, it turns out, as Bussman points out, and he's like the finance-minded guy, he like tries to go and give the robots $1 million, maybe not kill them, but that's a bit also absurd. He says, "I'm very much afraid we are surrounded." And another member of the group says, "By Jove, that's deuced quick work." So the robots have mastered communication in ways that surprise the humans due to how much they resemble, mimic, and successfully achieve communicational moves that are assumed to be the purview of the human. There's a lot more to say here, and I should note that this is, of course, only scratching the surface of discourse on the role of language and AI and robotics work. But I think that if we just take these very, in many ways, obvious parallels between Čapek's representation of the robots and the way they develop this indistinguishability from humans in appearance with Sulla at the start and then through language as the play progresses, and Wiener's writing on feedback, purpose, and cybernetic machines, that those parallels establish a fruitful avenue for exploring some of the intellectual and philosophical lineage that links their the two work and the two contexts. Okay. So there are two more things I want to touch on very briefly here by way of conclusion. First is the way that R.U.R and Wienerian cybernetics are united in their critique of automation due to how it threatens work. And second is their shared commitment to what we might call an ethos of responsible innovation. And this is going to work by what I'm calling just a series of comparative snapshots so that I can show you a few quotations, say a few things about them, and then if you have additional questions, we can come back to it during the discussion part. Okay, so this heading at the top, this sort of idea that if you lower the cost of production, you're going to guarantee mass unemployment. This could be a thesis if you were writing a paper that you could have a paragraph on R.U.R and you could have a paragraph on Wiener, and they're making very much the same types of arguments. Within the context of the R.U.R, the Rossum's Universal Robots Factory, lowering the cost of production is really the driving kind of raison d'etre of this whole undertaking. So Helena at this point is kind of trying to wrap her mind around what's going on, and they're chatting with her. And Bussman at this point, he says, "We turn them out at such a cheap rate. All prices are today a third of what they were, and they'll still fall lower." She says, "I don't understand." And he says, "Bless you, Miss Glory." There's a lot of infantilizing of the female character, which leads to their downfall as well, because she burns the recipe to make new robots, and that's the only thing they could negotiate with. Anyway, it's really unfortunate that they don't actually engage with her as an adult rather than a child. Anyway, he says, "It means the cost of labor has fallen." So he's saying, soon, moving down, the cost of everything will be 1/10 of what it is today. 5 years will be up to our ears in corn and everything else. Produce, produce, produce. The cost of production, lower it. That's the only thing we need to do. So Alquist is sort of like the voice within the group of the conscience about how this may not be the best thing ever. He says, yeah, and all the workers throughout the world will be unemployed. But Damen, he has this sort of vision of utopia in the future where there will be no work, no poverty, living machines will do everything, and humans can just live to perfect themselves. So they're having this exchange here near the start of the play, and then sort of things snowball, and we see what happens as this plays out, and it's not a good thing. Okay, so this type of an idea, almost verbatim, and we looked at this yesterday in one of the classes, appears in Norbert Wiener's writing. He fairly famously, in 1949, sent a letter to Walter Reuther, who was the president of the American Auto Workers Union in Detroit. And we get many of the same ideas here, although the perspective is kind of flipped, because Norbert Wiener is taking on the perspective of the more sincere technologist, mathematician, technical guy who has adopted a more socially minded or ethically focused stance that prioritizes these considerations of impact. So he says he's been interested in the problem of automatic machinery for a long time, as well as its social consequences. And then apparently a corporation has approached him saying, like, should we make automatic stuff? And he basically says that, like, if I were just going to be a technical person, I'd be like, yes, of course you should. Here's how you can do it. This is a mini description of a cybernetic machine that is going to kind of use the feedback it gets to improve what it's doing. It's like, he's like, yeah, you could do this. But he says that the apparatus he would instruct a company to make is flexible, acceptable to mass production, and will undoubtedly lead to a factory without employees. And he says that in the hands of what is currently our setup in industry, this would be disastrous. So he has this very strong sense that if the technologies that could be developed are developed in the current world, it's going to be awful. There will be mass unemployment. It will be terrible. So we get that coming through in Čapek as well, but through the kind of ironic perspective, like, what happens if we do that? It is disastrous. Okay, so the kind of counterpart to this, I'd say the maybe flip side of the coin is that as they make these arguments about labor, both Čapek and Wiener are wanting to call attention to or raise questions about the ethical responsibility of technological developers. So there's a section right before Helena figures out what's going on where she's talking with her servant and they're looking through newspapers. They get this sense that people are trying to keep something from them. All the men don't want them to know what's happening. So they go and look through and they read all these headlines that are about war and kind of general mayhem and violence and death around the world. And Nana, who's kind of like Alquist, thinks that the robots are terrible and they should stop making them. She says, what do you expect? Why do you keep selling thousands of these heathens, these robots, as soldiers? And Helena's response is really telling for kind of parroting what Damen and the folks working at the factory have as their attitude. They say, we can't know. Damen can't know what they're going to be used for. When an order comes in for them, he must just send them out. So we get an order for robots. All we're doing is making them and sending out. We don't have anything to do with them. So there's this critique of the kind of separation from the social fabric and abdication of responsibility that we see coming through in these little passages here. In Norbert Wiener's letter, he says a few times that he does not want to be responsible for this state of affairs. He's trying to figure out how he, as a person with technical expertise, cannot get sucked in and be part of perpetuating these problems. So what he does individually, he says, I've turned down unconditionally the request of the industrial company which has tried to consult me. He also refused to work with the military. So he refuses individually to be part of it. And he has this kind of philosophical section here where he says, I don't want to contribute in any way to selling labor down the river. And I'm quite aware that any labor, which is in competition with slave labor, whether the slaves are human or mechanical, must accept the conditions of work of slave labor. So he's saying it doesn't matter if you allow some particular workers to be in these conditions, you're bringing everyone to that level where this is what work now means. But he also says, like, okay, I'm not going to do it, but he's trying to figure out what he can proactively do. Because he says, if I just remain aloof to this, all that means is that the development of these ideas are going to go into other hands, which will probably be much less friendly to organized labor. So he's really trying to think about what someone could do to try and kind of shift the direction, because he sees it as inevitable. We could talk about that and whether that's true. But he's trying to work out what he can do. So his response here is write to the Auto Workers Union and see if he can get them to advocate for things like policy that will protect workers. So it's a bit more of a concrete and kind of action-oriented on the ground framework for dealing with some of the same questions that Čapek is asking us to kind of ponder and confront in the play. All righty. So what I'd like to leave you with is a few thoughts here are some questions that I hope what I've covered today and maybe what we talk about in the discussion will have prompted for you. And the first set of things here is, and this is drawing from a literary critic, Karel Čapek, who talks about different genres as having different affordances, things that they enable, things they make possible, as well as different limitations they have. But we've looked at Čapek's play, so an example of modernist era drama. Some critics describe it explicitly as modernist, some don't put it in that category, but drama from the early 20th century. With Norbert Wiener, we've seen his letter, as well as the books he's written about cybernetics theories. And we had, again, a really interesting conversation about this question of genre yesterday in the computer science ethics class. I'd invite you to think about, like, what are the things that we get differently when these arguments come at us through dramatic theater versus more kind of technical writing. So as you are listening to or watching R.U.R play out on the stage, I invite you to consider, what is it that makes literature, artistic production, aesthetic representation, and most specifically the theater, an interesting or potentially productive space, venue, a format through which to stage these kind of ethically oriented critiques and arguments. So I've given you some other examples. Now you can go see R.U.R. Just think about, like, what's going on differently. How do they complement one another? How are they working towards different ends? And the other set of questions came out, I think that he's not here anymore. I had a conversation yesterday about, like, we can't just collapse everything. It's not as though 1920s Czech automation and robots is identical to 21st century Cylons on the screen, right? So my goal, I want to just sort of get this on here. My goal is not to collapse those distinctions and differences between the historically specific representations of artificial life that Čapek is crafting in his play, and that either the post-World War II world that Wiener and his contemporaries occupied, or our own 21st century kind of algorithmically saturated society is in, because the mechanization of factory work in the early 20th century is a very different undertaking than, say, like the monetization of the attention economy that we often see now in kind of online ads and stuff like that, although they're both mobilizing some of the same types of goals and values around topics like optimization and efficiency of different forms of labor. But as you engage with R.U.R. and think about how it's foreshadowing in ways that I think tie back to what Alexander Weinstein talked about, so many of the dynamics that are at play in Wiener's writing and our own world, I also encourage you to think about what makes each of these historical moments unique and specific, because I think if we toggle between those different observational and analytic lenses, like looking for and seeing the parallels, but then saying, like, okay, but what's happening in this specific context? I think that would give us the capacity to have some important transhistorical insights that nonetheless remain grounded in the temporal specificity of one case study. And as a final thought here, I just want to telescope outwards and say a few words about what I see as the promise or the payoff of this type of approach that I've been trying to demonstrate through this talk and through other research more broadly. And this is a quotation from a well-known literary critic and theorist, media theorist, Kate Hales. And I think she really beautifully encapsulates the idea of interdisciplinary research across literary and scientific contexts as a mutually beneficial endeavor. It's not that, you know, humanities folks need to kind of tag on, or that like science folks need to become experts in literature. But she says that scientific texts, things like we've seen with what Norbert Wiener is doing, they often reveal, as literature cannot, the foundational assumptions that give theoretical scope and artifactual efficacy to a particular approach. Literary texts, in the inverse, and not exactly inverse, but like differently, they often reveal, as scientific work cannot, the complex cultural, social, and representational issues that are tied up with conceptual shifts and technological innovations. So I think this type of a framework or type of a provocation, I like that word today, I kept finding it throughout my text, I hope I haven't said it 80 times, that this is especially salient at an institution like MTU, and I would say also at the University of Waterloo, known in Ontario as a tech-focused, innovation-focused institution. Because this invitation here invites us to work across disciplinary silos, right? To engage with, rather than shy away from, the important ethical issues that are always part and parcel of tech work. Artistic work, whether it's on the page, on the stage, or in other forms, I think it can serve as what my colleague Marcel O'Gorman at Waterloo calls an object to think with. So a play like R.U.R, we see even like in this room today, can bring us together so that we can observe, debate, question, and hopefully better understand the complexity of the relationships that exist, have existed, and continue to develop between technology and society. So I hope this talk, as well as the broader range of programming that the Robot101 initiative has made available, will prompt anyone listening here to seek out those conversations and collaborations and other forms of interactions on these topics with folks who are working across humanities, social sciences, and STEM disciplines. And on that note, I will open it up to some conversations. So thank you very much.
So I was thinking about the conversation regarding the robots and the language that they had used to kind of assemble together, and the "that's absurd, who taught them to talk this way." And I was thinking of reading Bell Hooks and how she quotes Adrienne Rich and says, "This is the oppressor's language, but I must use it to speak to you." And I think about that alongside the parallel where you had said that the robots were sometimes counted and countered in terms of how many languages they knew, that was sort of this measure of intelligence. And it seems so interesting to me, and kind of, I think that there's a critique or a conversation in there that the writer of the play chose to have them write this in English on this handbill, despite knowledge of military tactics that might suggest that they use language in a different way, in a different form, that the humans may not understand but that the robots would.
So question there, do you mean that because this is coming on a handbill, it's a different form of language that's different or distinct from military language, or?
I more so mean because they've chosen English.
Okay.
Primarily because if they know all of these other languages and the humans that they are speaking with know English, if they wanted to assemble in a military tactic way, I find it very interesting. I mean, English was rather clearly chosen in order to further the conversation that exists in the play, but it sort of speaks back to that conversation of "this is the oppressor's language, but I must use it to speak to you." This idea that they had to use English for us to have this whole conversation here.
So what's the story of the translation and language of the play? Because one thing that's kind of interesting is when I was doing some research for this, a lot of sources talk about Japan as a site of influence because the play was very quickly translated to Japanese and produced in Japan. So I feel like you two probably know more about this than me. Like, what's the track of the language? I don't actually know this, and I feel like next week's speaker, he's going to know it off the top of his head. And so I feel a little ill-equipped to get to the language parts of it.
So we're doing an adaptation. The way that we're approaching the handbill is that throughout the play, the robots are in the action of the play, communicating with each other in ways that the humans can't understand. That they have this computer communication, but it all goes through the central computer. And so later on, Helena actually is able to ask the computer for what kind of communication is going on. And the computer, which is an earlier, is an earlier sort of version 1 kind of computer, says, "Oh yeah, they're doing this." And she's like, "Well, what is it? Can you translate it for me and print it out for me?" And so in that regard, for our production, they are not putting up handbills that the humans can read. They are communicating in their own language that the humans don't have access to, but then the humans find out how to get access to that and print out the handbill. And they're like, "Whoa, that's not good."
So that's super interesting. Also, if we think about even this as back to the question of genre, like what are the affordances of drama as a genre, in that you have this text on a page, which is your script, in a particular language, whether it is English here or Japanese or other languages into which it's translated, or Czech, yes, right, that you can then take the words on the page and put them into these embodied material, staged versions that allow the language to speak in different ways to a particular culture.
As a director, I also want to talk about translation because the play wasn't written in English. It was written in Czech, but in a specific time period. And every time you have a translation, the person, like, you can't literally translate anything. And you have to try to translate the intention. And I've done some translating myself, and it's very hard to decide which of the subtle culturally and socially understood meanings do you want to choose for your translation, because they're not a one-to-one. And so many of the English translations that people are working with when they're talking about R.U.R. Are represent the way that colonialist America and Britain were thinking in 1920, whatever, right? So they are a translation that we would not make now because they were imposing their own lens on the words they chose to with which to make the translation. And I just think that's super, super important because it wasn't written in English. And so there's a lot of leeway and there's a lot of translations. And one of the things that is beautiful about Lee Shackelford's, he has a play translation, and what we're using is the radio drama translation, is not only his work with getting at perhaps the cultural intent in a way that is more true to what that means now, because of course language ages and what words meant 100 years ago is not what they mean now. So even in English, it's not the same. You have to translate it. And also looking for the threads of narrative that would make more social and cultural sense because we live in a different cultural time.
Yeah, and
So,
that's
so
great.
it's
Yeah.
translation is super, super important. And I don't want us to sometimes think about, oh, this was an intent, when maybe it's an error in translation. Yeah.
Yeah,
or
and so what's
lens.
beautiful there is you're thinking about and asking us to think about precisely this idea that I wanted to get at there. Like when you're watching the play, you can think about how does this resonate now? What might this have resonated at a particular moment? You've got translations across language, across time, across geographies, and all those things across ideologies, across sort of broader cultural outlooks. And that attending to those things and looking at the specifics of a particular iteration of a play, and then looking at it in the broader spectrum as well. I think that's where some of the really fascinating connections come through. So thank you for contributing in there, adding in. I love it.
I was just thinking about well, before Čapek wrote Rozumnoví univerzální roboty, he was actually studying. He was a philosopher, and he was reading, I think, a lot of Hegel, phenomenology of spirit, and Kant, and but Wiener, right? He's out of a different tradition of philosophy, so they have different conceptions of human consciousness and different. So I just wonder if you've thought about those differences that might account for something of the different, the tongue-in-cheek aspects of the play, or?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So I have not dove in. I've not yet kind of really plunged into the philosophy behind it. I mean, the like master-slave dialectic is one way of thinking of what's going on through the play. Like that would work as sort of a quick mapping onto it. Wiener's training sort of at Harvard, like he worked with Josiah Royce there and then with Bertrand Russell when he was at Cambridge for a year. So that kind of philosophical. Yeah.
So like thinking about the mind, like almost from like a 17th century kind of Cartesian understanding of mind. Whereas like Čapek would have been working out of a kind of more phenomenological tradition that thinks about the body in relation to the mind and not thinking them as separate.
Yeah, and so actually that's interesting in light of Kate Hales. One of the big critiques she has of cybernetics and looking at Wiener in particular is the sort of assumption that information can become bodiless, right? That you can separate out these patterns and flows of data from their material instantiation. He's got this phrase where he's like, wouldn't it be cool? I mean, it's instructive to think about if you could just basically fax a human being and then reconstitute them in some new matter in another place. Because, I mean, the beautiful way is that he's got a line that we are not material that endures, we are like patterns that perpetuate themselves, which I think is a lovely way of thinking even about cellular reproduction. But she's making the critique that if you assume that there is this separability, then you lose the body and you lose embodiment. And that is a problem because there is no intellect, information, any of this stuff without bodies. And I mean, this, if we think of 21st century context, all this stuff about like cloud computing, oh, but all the gigantic data farms, they have a material representation. But yeah, that's a great idea, thinking about what Čapek is doing and how he roots things in these bodies and keeps them there in our face and keeps them there on the stage. I want to think more about it. Thank you. This is sort of an early foray into the world of Čapek and thinking about him in dialogue with Wiener. So that's great. Appreciate it. Thanks.
This is a little bit separate, but do you even know anything about what Reuther's response was and if that triggered any kind of change in the labor movement at that time?
I don't know a lot of details. I believe it didn't go very far. I don't think that many of Wiener's attempts at sort of having these things like, I will not work for the military. It's not like everyone else followed him. He kind of got blacklisted. I don't think it went too far, but the letter got known really well. But if anyone else is more on that, please feel free to chime in. More avenues to discover. This is great too, because this talk is at the point sort of noticing these connections and thinking about where to build from them. So I think that's a good direction. This is not related all that much, except for the idea of like an author sending out something to a person that then results in the change. I was just teaching The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and the idea that you write the story and then the doctor that you're calling out and critiquing actually changes the rest cure in light of your story. Makes me, I'll do a little bit more work on that.
I want to thank you for, that was really a wonderful presentation and really, really provocative. And the, on the issue that you talk about either looking for parallels or looking for threads or looking for differences, all of those issues connect with problems of translation, you know, how things change or remain the same, what pieces are new, right? What pieces
How things
are old.
evolve and
Yes.
shift. Yeah.
And I was thinking about the concept of labor and how that would be one place where the difference of what counts as labor and the way labor gets talked about as the slave performing the labor or the robot performing the labor would really change from the time of the play to now. And then there's this separation in the quotes that you put up of between when Wiener is talking about labor and laborers and organized labor, he doesn't clearly consider himself a laborer, right?
Yeah.
And you can see in the language about labor, labor is done by somebody over there.
Menial, physical,
and
yeah.
really attached to the Industrial Revolution. But with the development of more the service industry and the sort of changes in the perceptions of labor beginning in, I guess, in the 50s and 60s in particular, or the post-war, where we start talking about an information society. And I think of the work of Dallas Smythe talking about the audience as doing labor just by watching.
Yeah, or like the clicking and you're doing the work of making the money for the company by
Right.
scrolling and seeing things even. The
That
viewer,
the whole notion of who is the robot or who is the slave, you don't need to have robots to become that kind of laborer. And when it was, especially, there was a moment when you were talking about how if you have slaves or robots as laborers, it reduces labor to that, right?
That one there.
Yeah, yes. And the thing is, it's I think that drilling down into that even a little bit more about a completely different concept of labor has emerged.
Yeah, so this makes me think of a presentation associated with a conference last year, the AI for Equity conference, and it was a keynote by Katina Michael, who's at ASU, and she was doing this analysis of the ways in which like rideshare services like Uber and Lyft have completely changed the labor conditions for New York City cab drivers with very disastrous, to use the words of these presentations, mental health outcomes for those people. And the type of labor that is going into like an app on a phone that is attached to this kind of dispersed system of drivers versus, it's gig labor, it's all the things about, no benefits, long hours, but the way that it changed taxi cab drivers, which is a type of labor that has had a fairly long and fairly sort of steady definition of what it is. And there's all the studies that write of how New York taxi drivers, their brains are different because they have such a detailed mental map of the city. And that type of labor has a loss of relevance in the world of Google Maps, or, it's different types of specialized knowledge that leads to different types of labor being available. Anyway, and then the technologies come into it, and if we're thinking, going into competition with slave labor, a driver going into competition with a technologically enabled driving thing where there's a human in the car, but they're being told where to go by the app only. Anyway, I think that context maybe speaks to some of what you're getting at, that if we take the specific situated types of technologies and their affordances at a given moment, then these words that translate across have different meanings. I always also think about labor in the play and what it might be saying about reproductive labor when the humans are the only ones that have the capacity to reproduce for the robots even. So that's a whole nother can of worms that I think could be worth getting into. But yeah, thanks for the question.
I wanted to take us back to the moment where you're talking about R.U.R as template. So not to say actually something from the 19th century came first, but R.U.R is clearly different from Frankenstein. So what do you think are the sort of key differences that make this distinct? And is it collectivity? Because my sort of immediate response is there's more than one of them.
Yeah. And I guess also, so a few things that come to mind. One is I just got to do a super fun presentation with a former colleague of mine who studies the Romanticism, and it was about Jeanette Winterson's work and looking at sort of Frankenstein and cybernetics. And anyway, it was fun. So I love this pairing. So I think scale is one thing for sure. And there are so many gigantic numbers that just get thrown around in this play that I think he's asking us to think about what happens when the scale of production increases so exponentially that it becomes hard for a human to even conceive of it. So that'd be one thing. Also, there's a parallel in that idea of the robot's eloquence. And I think Frankenstein's creature is much more eloquent than the robots in this play. I don't think they're at that level, but the idea that the authors are both using the idea of language and eloquence and the ability to interact through speech or writing as part of the gambit, I think that's important. But also there's the misrecognition that happens with the robots who could be human is so different, right? Because the physically embodied sort of grotesqueness or the immediate recoil that every person who encounters the creature has is not at all what's going on here. This is about what happens when you can't even actually tell. Well, there's different grades of people. You could tell that the street sweepers who are not the highest robots, they're a bit weird. Like the idea of the uncanny is all through this, and I need to also do my historical research on when Freud stuff comes out with respect to this, because it's a bit of a jumble for me in all the years. But Helena is very she finds it off-putting, the presence of these workers doing human things in ways that aren't quite human. And then she finds it even more off-putting and disturbing when she actually didn't realize it was a robot. So I think that might be also important to think about. There's a few thoughts. We can talk more.
As kind of a follow-up question to that, my favorite book is Animal Farm.
Okay.
And you're familiar with it?
Yes, although it's been a long time since I actually read it. But yes, I'm familiar with it.
Me too. I noticed as you were kind of describing the plow line of R.U.R, the robots, kind of being uncontent with the way things were revolting successfully, and then kind of having to figure out how to kind of proceed from there with their production and things like that. Would you draw? And I know both texts were written for different purposes, but would you draw any similarities between the two in terms of the end message?
So I will confess that I am not as up on that particular Orwell book to be able to say, here's the exact parallels. That one written as a much more explicit allegory, I think might be an important thing to consider there, given that, of Orwell's various works, it's the most kind of historically specific kind of Russian Revolution context. And I think they attempt to do an allegorical translation, if we're talking about translations, with the one-to-one correlations of so many things, is doing something a little bit different than these types of more speculative imagined works that certainly are dealing with similar themes about power and hierarchies and small groups of people exerting huge forces and pressures on very large amounts of people. But the ability to kind of leap from context to context through analogical or analogy-based translations is, I think, deliberately maybe foreclosed a bit in a work like Animal Farm, where the author sets out that much more kind of tightly defined set of restrictions. So that's maybe one thing that would be a little bit different between the two of them. I would need to go and reread it though to be able to say like, oh yeah, here's where something that's happening. Because I don't know if Čapek is also thinking about like Soviet context in here. I know less about that, and so I would need more research on that one first. Thanks for the question.
Very much.
I have two things. I just wanted to point out that the mind-body discussion and whether those are one and the same or different is really very similar to the what is labor question, and especially through that. And it's really central to what we do as artists in terms of finding an embodiment of language and the emotional flow of how all of that is connected. And so that I'm just listening to all of these and Frankenstein's monster and the embodiment and our revulsion or acceptance of that body is so important as well. And how dehumanization and demarcation of otherness and all of that plays out, that idea of body is so important. And whether or not our consciousness can move to things, right? Yeah, what is consciousness and how rooted in a body is that?
Which goes back to Clara and the Sun, right? That's the consciousness there. So yeah.
And then the other thing is we talked a little bit about translation earlier, and one of the things that we've spent a lot of time grappling with was that sense of historical particularities versus the more universal through lines, and kind of what you had talked about in terms of that specificity of period and time and what's going on there, but also how it's connected to much longer developmental ideas and building and connectivity was something that we worked with a lot, and looking at different translations and a lot of them going, I don't know if we really want to do that on stage.
Yeah, I know. And I have this one here, which is slightly arbitrary because it's hard to, I couldn't find sort of a definitive, here's the one to use. And you can watch different versions and they're all slightly different. And you're reading along and you're going like, that's not quite what I have here. So it is interestingly kind of blurry as well there.
And a lot of those things in terms of the infantilization of women and a lot of other ideas that were like, well, just really, this doesn't seem examined in this script. It seems, it's presenting it as accepted, right? And we're like,
yeah,
we're like, okay. So we found an adaptation that we thought approaches those in a way that we're encouraged to think about some of those issues, that really puts them in a dramatic context where we go, where our audience is not going to go with the flow and is going to go, that's not, no.
Yeah. And I think it's really interesting that you picked the radio drama one, because there you've got a version that takes the visible bodies out of the context and then reinserts them with what you're doing. So I'm very, very intrigued to see how this all goes.
Because we had to, because of the way that our other shows in the season played out, we didn't have the scenery support and that sort of stuff. And so that was a budget decision.
Working constraints and affordances, right?
But sometimes those play out in interesting ways. They get you thinking about things. But I did really, as you mentioned that historical development, it really made me think about, oh, well, this is, R.U.R is scene 1, and then you've got scene 2 in the 50s, and then you've got our present day is, for us, the climax of our show. And, and through our show, one of the ways that we approach that historical thing is we've really rooted it in this period radio drama, but then as we get absorbed into the story, our production becomes much more modern, and we blur those.
So thinking of like the shifting media landscape as a filter for that.
Sort of, we take you there and we say, this is a period piece. This comes from a particular time and moment, but we're not experiencing it in that time. We're experiencing this now, and this is how we're responding it to, and this is how we can get you into the emotional flow of that, but also make this connection between period specificity and flow and development of ideas over time, and that they come from somewhere.
Awesome. I love it.
Thought that your moment there was just perfect for what we.
Well, I'm glad I did the type of setup that worked. This was not planned, folks. I love it. And I do want to just come back to the question about the philosophy, because I want to go and dig into this more. I think, because even thinking about translations and how you would represent something, and thinking, if you look to the philosophy that informs the art as a way to imagine, I know that you were thinking or asking students to say, how would you stage a particular scene? And if you've got sort of the media developments as one way of doing it, I wonder what sort of the philosophy as the organizing kind of driving force behind a stage production, what that could look like.
That was Wiener's kind of philosophical inheritance. That's where the difference is going to be about the lived temporality versus kind of clock time.
Clock time. All right. Like
That may be-
duration.
I don't know, that
But
could
yeah,
be.
that's actually interesting, because Wiener, you think clock time, but Wiener was just as much fascinated with analogical systems, like as opposed to kind of digital systems. So I think that often it's easy to conflate Wiener cybernetics, the digital, the computer, but so much of the work he was doing was interested in the human, the embodied, the analog. So I don't know that he's fully in that realm, but the way that he's working between them, more to think about. This is unformulated yet, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that it is a radio play, but it's also staged. So
Oh, I just meant like using the script of the radio play was very
Yes.
interesting as a
so
starting
there's a
point.
lot of moments where because there is a live studio audience, just like there would be in 1930, the characters are also giving like looks to each other that still are laden with meaning that if you were only listening, you wouldn't necessarily get.
The weekend at the performances at R.U.R. There are also performances the following weekend as well.